railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. It was not the first time he'd been sentenced to death. The 23-year-old former soldier said nothing as he was taken away. A condemned cell was waiting for him. Would he pay the ultimate penalty this time? Or would he escape the noose once again?
It was a time when the death penalty was being reviewed and was quite contentious, but in this case, people would have said, well, if he had faced punishment for the original crime, then actually he wouldn't have been free to have murdered a few years later.
He was given a pardon and his freedom, which allowed him to kill a second time several years later.
This is a case where a nice, inoffensive man might not have died if an earlier death sentence had been confirmed.
James John Alcott was born in Woolwich on the 13th of October, 1929. Soldiering was in his blood. His mother, Nellie, was the daughter of a Scots Guardsman. His uncle had been in the Coldstream Guards, and his father, Joseph, had served as a private in the Second World War. All his life, Alcott had wanted to follow in their footsteps. But young Jimmy was not an obedient child.
His mother described him as having a bit of trouble and in high spirits and that sort of thing when he was young.
His father seems to have been somebody who was absent a great deal of the time.
He was brought up very much by his mother, who lived in Bexley Heath in South London with 3 other children.
Young Jimmy seems to have got up to a fair amount of mischief, to have been a not untypical young tearaway. But as he moves into his early teenage years, he does descend into a greater criminality, somebody who is considered likely to become a career criminal unless action is taken.
When he was 10 years old, he was caught stealing a bicycle. He was stealing money by the time he was 11, and his behavior became so bad that he was sent to an approved school for young people beyond parental control. He was at the institution in Farnborough for 3 years.
Approved schools in those days were designed to try and turn juvenile offenders into more disciplined young adults.
It was a charity organisation. It was designed to help vulnerable young people and their families when they were in times of trouble.
For Jimmy Alcott to end up in one of them was a real positive attempt to make him into a useful member of the community.
But Alcott never gave up on his dream of becoming a soldier. When he left school, he joined the local cadets. In 1947, he turned 18. He'd grown into a tall and handsome young man. He volunteered for the Grenadier Guards. He was posted to Germany.
The Grenadier Guards were on occupation duties in Germany. It wasn't particularly exciting, it wasn't particularly challenging.
At the time, just after World War II, there was an awful lot of British soldiers stationed in Germany. It was the occupying army gradually returning the administration to normal civilian administration of the German state.
They're on guard duty, they're policing the black market, they're acting as an overseeing force as Germany tries to reconstruct itself.
Alcott, however, had not left his rebellious ways behind. In September 1948, he snuck away from his base in Germany and went wandering in the countryside. There, he met a Czech refugee. The pair decided to walk together to France.
Basically, Jimmy gets bored and decides to abscond. He's fed up with being a regular soldier. He's very clearly fed up with rules, regulations, and being told what to do.
Alcott said that he suffered at different times from blackouts, and it was allegedly during one of these blackout periods that he went AWOL, he went absent without leave.
They ended up in a small place called Munterbauer near Koblenz, and there was a lodging house or small hotel.
In its garage was a motor car. The two men tried to steal it, but there was a night watchman on duty. Peter Helm was his name, and when he went to stop the thieves, they attacked him.
They hit and assaulted this night porter, one with a fire extinguisher and one with a whiskey bottle.
We don't know what exactly instigated a brutal and fatal attack on the night watchman.
Two days later, Alcott was found and arrested. In January 1949, the young Grenadier Guardsman was hauled in front of a general court-martial.
A general court-martial is the highest level of court-martial, and it is the only one that has the power to pass a death sentence.
The normal court-martial dealt with all ranks in the army and general breaches of military law. A general court-martial dealt with commissioned officers and other ranks who had committed serious offences.
Effectively, it was a criminal trial, but within the military system with military law that governed how the proceedings should take place.
Alcott insisted he was innocent. The night watchman had offered them coffee, he said, but had then thrown boiling water in their faces. Alcott and his Czech friend had fought back in self-defense. He was not believed. Alcott was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But as the 19-year-old waited in a cell in Germany, his story took an extraordinary turn. Alcott's parents, Nellie and Joseph, didn't know about their son's arrest or his conviction. They'd received no official notification, and it was only when an army chaplain wrote to Mrs. Alcott that the truth came out. The newspapers soon took up the story. a Labour MP pressed the War Minister in Parliament. How could the parents not have been told their son had been tried for murder and condemned to death?
Jimmy's family are shown in the newspapers as a family that is shocked by the sentence passed on their son. So it's a human interest story. There is a subtext in there that A, he'd killed a foreigner, and B, that the attack had also involved another foreigner. So there's something of a hint reading between the lines of perhaps it was the foreigners who really did the fighting.
Death sentences handed down by court-martial had to be officially confirmed by the King, but for Jimmy Alcott the confirmation was delayed and delayed. Then, early in April 1949, a dispatch rider pulled up outside the home of Nellie Alcott. He was carrying a letter from the War Office. At first, Mrs. Alcott was too frightened to open it. When she finally worked up the courage to read the letter, she burst into tears. Her son's death sentence had been quashed. Jimmy was coming home. James John Alcott was given a second chance. His death sentence was commuted by the King. He returned to England, where he was discharged from the army.
The royal prerogative of mercy does not overturn the conviction. That still stands. So when Alcott was freed, he still had the conviction of murder against him.
It's a way of sweeping the whole thing under the carpet. There is a very clear hope that he has learned his lesson, and on return to England, to his family, he will settle down and be an improved character.
Still just 19 years old, he began to build a new life for himself. He got a job on the railways. It was a time of change in Britain. The post-war Labour government had embarked on a massive programme of nationalisation and reform. There was a brand new system of social security. The National Health Service had been founded, and strict controls were introduced on what could be built and where. The reforms touched almost every aspect of life in Britain, and the railways were no exception.
Originally, of course, they'd been set up by individual private companies with their own routes. Gradually, these had sort of amalgamated together. But during the war, they'd had to coordinate an awful lot more because of the war effort. And in 1947, they were nationalised as one national rail system under the British Transport Commission.
In 1947, the plans were introduced for the nationalisation of the railways. In 1948, nationalisation did take place, and there was this unification of all the companies into this one major unit.
By 1952, Jimmy Alcott was working as a railway fireman. He was based at the Hither Green depot in southeast London. He'd married a French woman, and the couple lived in her grandmother's flat on Eltham Palace Road.
He was a sociable man. It's certainly something that was noted of him by his fellow workmates at Hither Green, that he'd always stop for a chat rather than getting on with his job.
He got a job on the railway as a fireman, stoking the boilers of steam engines, which were very common in those days.
He doesn't seem to have distinguished himself in any particular way. He's just average. He doesn't make waves, but he doesn't win the approval of his superiors.
Monday the 18th of August was the first day of his annual leave. Alcott and his wife were planning to go to France. He went to the depot to collect his £16 holiday pay. But before he headed home to join his wife, there was one more thing he needed to do. He travelled to Aldershot. There he spent 15 shillings on a sheath knife. Then he made his way to the nearby village of Ash Vale.
He never seemed to go back to his wife and take her to France as he'd promised, and perhaps that was part of his unreliable character, that he was wandering off.
It's very plain that he deserts again, whether it's intended to be long-term, whether it's aberration, we just don't know, because he never provides any credible explanation. I find myself speculating that he's trying to meet up with old friends.
It's an area he would have had a reasonable knowledge of because of his school days and because of his military career.
It was probably that memory that had drawn him down to that area, and he visited the railway station.
Ash Vale stood on the line from Alton to London Waterloo. It was not a busy station most of the time, but at weekends it thronged with soldiers on leave from the nearby army base. In hours, it could sell hundreds of pounds worth of tickets. That money was Jimmy Alcott's target. He planned his robbery carefully. At first, he just watched. Ash Vale station was spread over 3 stories. Passengers entered at street level, they bought their tickets on the first floor, then climbed the stairs to the platforms and waiting rooms at the top. From 6 in the morning to 8 o'clock at night, at least 2 porters and a booking clerk were on duty. Every evening at 7:45, the clerk in the booking office drew down the shutters. Tickets and date stamps were handed to the senior porter. After that time, passengers had to buy their tickets on the platform.
We have to assume that Alcott did not manage to meet anybody from his previous life, and he therefore drifted to the railway to meet up with railway staff.
It was about 30 miles south of London. The station itself was very small, just a station and 2 lines running parallel to the Basingstoke Canal.
It was not a huge station, but it was a busy station. There was a lot of traffic, a lot of people from the garrison, the nearby military camp, would choose to use Ash Vale because it was more convenient than going all the way into Aldershot or all the way into Farnborough.
On Thursday, the 21st of August, Alcott returned once again to Ash Vale station. At around 5 in the afternoon, he asked senior clerk Norman Thompson if he could use the telephone in the booking office. He showed his British Railways staff pass. He wanted to call his depot.
He worked the sidings at Hither Green, which was quite a large goods yard, and in shoveling the sort of clinker, which is the remains of ash from the boilers of these steam engines, he'd apparently shovelled some of this out and had injured one of his colleagues.
An unconsidered motive behind his actions this week is an expectation that he's going to be disciplined or even dismissed on his return from his holiday, and that he wants to find out what's happening.
Alcott was let in. He phoned his depot. They were going to check, he said. Could he wait there for a call back?
No such call ever comes in, and he drifts off again, but he keeps coming back to Ash Vale.
Alcott was hanging around the station. There's no other word to describe it. He was there all the time.
In retrospect, it does seem that he was actually examining the normal working practices of the railway staff on that railway station to see what the pattern was when the booking office would close and so on.
There was no attempt to conceal an identity, which is surprising in view of what he was planning.
By closing time, Alcott had become so chummy with Norman Thompson that the older man offered him a lift back to Aldershot on his motorbike. Alcott knew the staff, their duties, their schedules. He knew where the money was kept and how he could access it, and he had the knife. Everything was ready. The next day was Friday. It would be one of Ash Vale's busiest days of the week, the perfect day for a robbery. Jimmy Alcott had finished his reconnaissance. It was time to put his plan into action. On Friday, the 22nd of August, 1952, he returned once more to Ash Vale Station. At 6:30 in the evening, he again asked to use the station telephone. He then got chatting with the booking clerk on duty in the tiny gaslit office. The clerk's name was Geoffrey Charles Dean. Like Alcott, the 27-year-old was an ex-soldier. He'd served with the paratroop regiment in Norway during the war. By August 1952, he had a 5-year-old daughter, and his wife was expecting their second child.
He was in charge of selling the tickets, counting the money. He was the booking office clerk, so he was in charge of running that.
He'd had this job for about 15 months or so, so he'd probably joined the railway as a booking clerk after he'd been demobbed after the war.
He is someone who had served with respectability, if not huge distinction. During the war, he had been a dutiful member of the armed forces, and he was very proud of that service.
His role at the station was that of sort of a wages clerk, and to see to the tickets and to tot up the cash at the end of each working day.
He settles down to work for the railway, marries, and becomes a much liked, a much respected member of the local community. He gets involved with local things like football, and he's not in any way an intemperate man. He's a dutiful and dedicated employee, and he was liked. Everybody liked this unassuming, inoffensive man.
Alcott lingered in the booking office with Dean. Like everyone else, he was soon calling Geoffrey Dixie. The nickname was inevitable. Dixie Dean was not only a world-famous footballer, he'd also worked on the railways as a boy.
He was Dixie Dean because of his own interest in football. And of course, these were the days when Dixie Dean, the great footballer, was still very much remembered and with huge affection.
Renowned for playing at Everton, he actually had the record number of goals scored in a season. People had nicknames in those days sort of very frequently. If his name was Woods, he'd have been called Timber. If his name was White, he'd have probably been called Chalky White. So he was known by his nickname of Dixie Dean.
At 7:45, as usual, Dixie closed the office hatch. He handed the tickets over to the senior porter on duty. He told him he'd be staying a little late to work on his accounts. A change in the fares was coming and he wanted to be ready.
That was part of his job. He had to make sure all the money tallied up and with all the records, and that was a job that they would have to do, by manuscript, because there weren't computers doing that sort of thing in those days.
The last thing the porter saw as he moved away from the office was Alcott sitting in the office talking to Dean.
Alcott was still there as Dean counted up the day's takings. Over £168, just shy of £5,000 in today's money. The pair chatted and joked. Dean was having trouble with his books. He was £10 over and couldn't work out why. But behind his smile, Alcott's thoughts were on his back pocket, where the knife was waiting in its sheath.
James Alcott had asked to use the telephone in the booking office to check up on this colleague that he had injured at Hither Green, and had actually, over that week, inveigled himself into the normal kind of activities of the staff, become known to the staff at Ash Vale, and they had trusted him as a fellow railwayman.
He doesn't seem to have raised any particular surprise or alarm or comment. He was a fellow railwayman, he was hanging around, nobody quite knew why, but he seemed affable and pleasant, and he's young and chatty, so why not?
At 8:45 that evening, Army Corporal Kenneth Vincent arrived at Ash Vale station. He climbed the steps to the first floor and went to the booking office to buy a ticket. The wooden shutter was down, but he could hear people inside, muffled voices, a scuffling sound. He rapped on the sill with the coin, but nobody came to the hatch. Then he saw the notice. After 8 p.m, passengers must buy tickets upstairs. The corporal left. He didn't know it, but just inches away on the other side of the hatch, Geoffrey Dean was fighting for his life. Alcott's attack had been sudden and vicious. He plunged his knife into the back of Dean's neck, but the booking clerk had fought back. He'd screamed for help, kicking and punching at Alcott. In the cramped space of the booking office, the two former soldiers had wrestled desperately over the knife.
It seems that he was very largely taken by surprise. One can only speculate that Alcott took him off guard, that he had absolutely no suspicion of Alcott having any sinister intent in spending time with him.
Dean was stabbed in the face, the chest, the abdomen.
He must have been stabbed continually long after he'd been unable to resist.
So it was very clearly a vicious, sustained and brutal attack.
Shortly before 9 o'clock, a 15-year-old porter spotted something strange. Young Cedric Bull had just helped a passenger take some luggage down from the platform to the street, and as he was heading back up the stairs, he tripped and fell. Getting up, he saw a light on in the booking office. Surely Dixie wasn't still working. He knocked. There was no answer. He tried the door. It was locked. Cedric went out of the station. He climbed the grass embankment towards the window of the booking office, and perching on the sill, he peered into the tiny room. He could see Dixie on the floor. The booking clerk was covered in blood, and he wasn't moving. The boy scrambled back down the slope and ran inside. He alerted the station master, Mr. Luck, who ordered the office to be forced open.
They saw Dean's body partly concealed by the desk. He was lying in a great pool of blood. The safe door was opening, and there was about £160 worth of cash had been taken from the safe.
Now, this must have happened within a very short time of the murder having happened. It's sometime between 8 and 9 that the murder was perpetrated. The body was actually found just after 9.
Poor Geoffrey Dean had suffered some really serious injuries.
He had been stabbed 20 times. One behind the ear was particularly deep and fatal. Another stab wound got the jugular.
He had 7 stab wounds in the back, 9 in the chest, one of which went through the sternum, the chest bone, into the heart.
Basically, there was no question of Dean being able to survive this frenzied attack.
Police were quickly alerted, but there could be no doubt as to who had committed this terrible crime. The attacker must have been the young, handsome railwayman who'd been hanging around the station for days. But by then, James John Alcott was nowhere to be seen. Police arrived at Ash Vale station within an hour of the murder. The booking office was photographed. Then the body of clerk Geoffrey Dean was removed to Farnham mortuary. The police investigation moved rapidly. They commandeered a waiting room by the platform and began interviewing passengers and staff at Ash Vale.
The overall investigation was in the hands of the Surrey Constabulary. They were assisted by their local Hampshire Constabulary, and they in turn were assisted by the British Transport Police.
The railway police undertook all the railway connected inquiries, and the Surrey police took over the other inquiries round Aldershot and so on. The inquiries soon led to the suspicion about James Alcott, and he was an unusual character, if not downright suspicious. He'd been hanging around, so it was natural the police should want to trace him.
A description of the chief suspect was circulated to cafes and shops in the area, and a check was made of all local hotels and lodging houses. Police quickly scored a lead. There was a bed and breakfast in Aldershot at number 10 Victoria Road. A young man had checked in there late the previous night. The owner, Mrs. Edith Dagger, confirmed to a police constable that her new guest matched the description of the wanted man. In the front bedroom on the first floor, the constable found a blood-stained navy blue jacket. In the pocket were 2 10-shilling notes and a passport in the name of James John Alcott.
Alcott was not a particularly clever man. I don't even know whether he'd actually intended to kill Dean, and that quite literally he was bewildered. He did not know what to do.
James Alcott was a strange character, and probably had been a strange character ever since he was a boy.
It seems, looking at his youthful behaviour, that he had no idea of what the logical consequences of some of his actions would be.
He doesn't return home, he doesn't hide, he just makes it easy for the police to find him. And I think that is explicable only by saying that, quite literally, he himself did not know what to do and where to go.
After his savage attack on Geoffrey Dean, Alcott had moved quickly. A Mac had been hanging on the back of the door, and Alcott grabbed it, pulled it over his blood-stained clothes. Emptying the safe, he'd stuffed the money and his knife into his pockets and hurried away from the station. At a stream nearby, he'd washed the blood from his hands. Then he'd caught a number 44 bus from North Camp back to Aldershot and gone to the pub.
It is very difficult to work out exactly what was going on in his mind.
He didn't seem to make any attempt to go to France with his wife or to leave the area, and I think nobody quite understood his mentality.
He had his passport with him, and instead of making his way abroad or back to London, he stayed overnight in the area, and so a door-to-door inquiries the next morning quickly located his presence.
The next day, as police closed in, Alcott went shopping. He bought a new jacket, some grey flannel trousers and a pair of shoes. He wrapped his old trousers in paper and dumped them on waste ground near Ordnance Road in Aldershot. But when he returned to his lodgings at 11:15 that night, the police were waiting for him.
He virtually admitted that he had been involved in the murder. And first of all, he denied knowing where the knife was, but then said that the knife was hidden up the chimney.
He must have realised that having spent 3 days at the Ash Vale station, there were people who knew him. They knew his name. They knew the station he worked at in London. They'd seen his British Rail pass.
When he was arrested, he made no secret of the fact that he had been responsible for the attack. So there was never any question of it being important to look for anybody else.
Alcott's trial at the Surrey Assizes began on the 18th of November 1952. No witnesses were called for the defence. Alcott's barrister tried to plead insanity. Why else would the killer make such a poor attempt to conceal his crime?
The only defence that was possible was that Alcott was not sane at the time, that he had suffered a fit of temporary insanity.
With the murder of Peter Helm, he said that he'd had these periodic blackouts, and at his trial he again referred to these periodic blackouts. He'd said that he'd suffered one at the time of the murder, and in fact he didn't even know why he was at Aldershot, but he'd also admitted the killing. He told the police on at the time of his arrest that he had done the killing, so it was a cast-iron case against him.
With the forensic science examination, the blood stains on the knife and on the wallet and on banknotes and on Alcott's clothes were all found to be blood group O, and that matched Geoffrey Dean's blood group. They also found some fibres on the knife, on the murder weapon, which matched a pullover that Geoffrey Dean had been wearing at the time.
Circumstantial evidence, forensic evidence, all makes it absolutely clear that Alcott was the one who wielded the knife and took the life of Geoffrey Dean. No question of it.
The jury, 10 men and 2 women, deliberated for 20 minutes. Then they returned with their verdict. Alcott was guilty. The judge, Mr. Justice Finnemore, sentenced the 23-year-old to death. Alcott had heard the words before. But this time there'd be no newspaper campaign, no questions in Parliament, and no reprieve. Alcott was executed at Wandsworth Prison on the 2nd of January 1953.
The local papers, though they acknowledge that he had previously been sentenced to death and been reprieved, there's no sign of any major popular outcry, which I have to admit I find surprising.
Perhaps out of loyalty to the armed forces and the Grenadier Guards, they just regarded it as something very separate from if it had been a murder that had been committed on British soil.
To have criticised the previous decision would, of course, have been to criticise the recently deceased king. So I think that helps to explain why more is not made of that particular aspect. And it's more a question of, well, he was lucky before, this time justice has caught up with him properly.
He knew what he was doing. He seemed to plan the murder because he bought the knife in advance. He seemed to be casing out the railway station in order to work out the best opportunity for committing the crime.
The real sympathy goes to Dean's wife and daughter, and that's where the real comment comes in. In many ways, Alcott is dismissed.
Alcott's victim, Geoffrey Dean, was laid to rest on the 29th of August 1952. The cemetery by St. Peter's Church in Ash was just a short distance from the railway. As 27-year-old Dean's coffin was lowered into the earth, amid the tears of family and friends, a passing train slowed to a mournful pace.